Alright, I want everybody to close their eyes and imagine that you just walked off the lot, brand new car. Brand new sports car, $60,000, it's got all the bells and whistles, right? So you're cruising along and you find this open road and you look around, there's no cops. And gotta make sure there's no cops. So you want to test out the power of your new car. So you sit there, you turn it on this open road, and you smash it to the floor, and it just kind of feels down on power. It doesn't feel like nothing's there. And so you're sitting there waiting, you look at your RPM gauge, and it's reading about 4,000, and right at 5,000 RPM, it sounds like a jet just went off in your engine, right? And next thing you know, you're looking down your speedometer, you're doing 100 miles an hour, and you're sitting there wondering what just happened to your car. Well, my friend, in a quick 4 to 6 minute speech, I'm going to teach you about turbos. Alright, so what does a turbo look like? Well, in traditional inline 4 to 6 setups, this has to be inline 6 out of a Toyota Supra. Right here, this is what the turbo looks like. It's on the exhaust manifold side of a motor. And then on traditional V8s, this happens to come out of an LS motor, which comes out of most Corvettes. That's what twin turbos look like. V8s, that's usually, they put them twin turbo. I'll explain what twin turbos are later. So yeah, that's what they look like. So what's happening inside the motor that causes the power? Well, I'll get into what causes power in a little bit. But basically, this is your engine right here. It only shows one piston just to keep it simple. The exhaust flows out of the exhaust pipes. It goes into the turbo, or into the turbine, part of the turbo, and then cold air is air itself is pushed out of the turbo into the intercooler, back into the motor. I'll explain why that causes power in a moment. So this is how turbos work. The exhaust gases that are coming out of the engine cause to go into the turbine and cause the impeller inside of the turbine to spin. The impeller that's inside the turbine is connected to the compressor part of the turbo. The reason why it takes so many RPMs to spool up a turbo, and the term spool up, which means gets the turbo spinning, is because this impeller in here has to spin upwards of 100,000 revolutions per minute. So it takes a lot of time to spool up, and it takes a lot of gas. Once it is spooled up, the turbo starts making usable boost, and I'll explain what boost is later. It travels down, goes into a charged air cooler, which cools down the air, keeps it cool so you don't overheat your motor, and goes back into the motor, creating boost. So next, we'll go into what turbos can do for me. There are two different uses for turbos. The most common use right now is for performance uses, drag racing, drifting, any other type of racing that you could think of. They usually use turbos. Drifting turns more into a different type of power adder, but that's not in this speech. And then the next is for better mile per gallon. A lot of cars these days, and I mean a lot of them, are starting to use what are called EcoBoost motors. And EcoBoost motors are really small motors that have turbos installed. So I'm going to go a little bit more into how a turbo can boost my mile per gallon. Car and Driver magazine stated that EcoBoost cars or EcoBoost motors can improve your highway MPG by 65% and your city MPG by 5%. The way they do this is that on the interstate, when you're driving along, your motor is typically in a higher RPM because you're at a higher speed, and thus causing a turbo to spool up. And so when you have such a small motor, such as like maybe a 4-cylinder motor that maybe produces 93 horsepower, it'll struggle without a turbo to create the power that it needs to accelerate and to keep and maintain speed. So a turbo will add more power, therefore giving it more miles per gallon, not making the engine work harder. You also see these in turbo diesels whenever they're climbing a hill and you press on the throttle more. Instead of raising your engine RPM, what it'll do is it'll actually allow more boost into the motor. And this is all done electronically, so you can boost your MPG. This is why boost is important. Boost adds more air into the engine. When you have more air into the engine, you can create more fuel. And the more fuel that you can burn, the more powerful the motor will be. So it is crucial that you must know the air-to-fuel ratio in a motor, because if you don't, you could possibly blow it up. So I'll briefly go over fuel maps. Fuel maps is what you tune the motor to. So usually what you do is you'll take it over to a dyno, and a dyno is just basically a computer that's hooked up to your motor, and you do a couple full throttle pulls on the car and raise RPM, phase boost, and it'll tell you everything that's going on, horsepower, torque, the air-to-fuel ratio, everything. It'll tell you literally everything that's going on in the car. And the reason why fuel maps are so important is that when the engine starts to create power, it'll need a certain fuel ratio and air-to-fuel ratio. And if you don't have the correct one, like I said, you could blow up your motor. What you mostly see on an engine dyno is that when boost is starting to be created and the turbo starts to spool up, they'll have the incorrect fuel map and it'll immediately start to lean out, which means all the fuel will be taken out of the motor, thus starving the motor, thus creating a lot more heat and a lot more friction inside of the motor, causing the motor to blow up. And this is where I got all my information from. The second website, which is basically on the parts of a turbo, and they stated that more air, more fuel makes more power. And I will go ahead and give a little personal experience. I've driven well over 100 different cars that are turbocharged, both EcoBoost and performance. I think the fastest car I've driven was pushing 950 horsepower. It would do 0 to 60 like you wouldn't believe. So, in conclusion, I feel turbos are very important in nowadays, especially with the fuel pinch that we're having, and also for performance needs, because in my opinion, turbos are the greatest thing you'll ever experience in your life. There's nothing like just smashing on a throttle, hear the turbo spool up, sound like a jet, and throw the tail end of a car around. And in my opinion, having fun in life is the most important thing in life.